Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf tzadi vav. We're going to start with a quick review of the end of yesterday's daf. We saw that there was this oven. Rav Yitzchak said if you smeared the fat of the meat on the sides, you couldn't kosher it, to which we then proved that that wasn't true, and you can kosher ovens. If you can kosher ovens, the Gemara asked them, what about Rav? Why did Rav make everybody break their earthenware vessels before Pesach? Because of the issue of chametz shavar alav Pesach, right? The chametz that's left to be used after Pesach, right? The chametz that was still around over Pesach, it was absorbed in your sides of your pan. So now, your pot, and now when you go to cook after Pesach, that's going to come out. And again, that means you're holding the chametz, even if it passed, Pesach is over, it's still forbidden with any small amount. If it was chametz that was in existence over Pesach. Anyway, why did he say you have to break all your vessels? Why didn't he just say, fire them up like you did with the oven? To which we answered, either the oven that we said could be kosher wasn't earthenware, or it was earthenware, but it's a difference because in the oven we make the fire inside, and the pots we do the fire on the outside. And if we try to tell people, well, maybe do it on the inside, they wouldn't really do it because they'd be worried their vessels would break. So now we're going to raise two difficulties on this point about saying that your vessels, theoretically, your earthenware vessels could be koshered if you were to put fire on the inside, just like the oven. And the earthenware vessels can be koshered with fire inside. Ella, starting from the top of our daf, why did the Torah then say we have to break all the earthenware vessels that were cooked in a kodshim, right? Sacrificial items. Nahadrinu lekivshonot. Why don't we just say put them back in the kilns, and there it'll burn them up, right? Very high fire, and we won't have to worry about it. Now, what about the fact that we just said maybe they're worried they're going to break? So perhaps we say in kilns they don't break. Or another possible answer is with the Rav's people's pots, the individual's pots, people are always worried their own individual pots will break. But when it's public property, people are not as careful about protecting public property. So the temple, they'll buy new ones if it breaks. What's the big deal? It's not my own personal worry. So people maybe aren't as worried about that, and they won't worry, oh, maybe it'll burn, maybe it'll break. So what's the answer to that question? Why did the Torah forbid this if really there was another solution? We don't want to make kilns in Jerusalem. It creates a lot of smoke, and the smoke makes the walls black. And we don't want the walls of Jerusalem to be ugly. We want Jerusalem, a special holy city. We don't want the walls to be blackened. So Amar Abai says, wait a minute. I'm missing something basic here. We don't want the walls of Jerusalem to be blackened. So because of that, we have to break every single earthenware vessel that items in the temple were cooked in. But we can make garbage dumps in the middle of the azara, because remember, these are earthenware vessels that have kedusha in them. We have to break them, and we can't take them out of the azara. They still have sanctified items in them, so they're going to stay in the azara forever. So, and try to imagine this: heaps of piles, right? Where is there even room in the azara for all this? But the main question here is not that; it's this is making this halacha. If you want to avoid making a disgrace of the walls of the city of Jerusalem, don't you have to worry about making a disgrace of the temple by having piles and piles of klei cheres, of broken shards of earthenware vessels? To which they answer, Abai, what do you mean? Did you forget what Shmaya said in Kalnevo? Kalnevo is a city. The name Nevo comes from one of the gods, pagan gods, Nevo. Shivrei klei cheres nivlein b'mkomam. One of the miracles that happened in the temple, that the broken vessels of all these broken vessels were swallowed up, and that, by the way, answers both questions. Answers the question the Gemara asked about, well, we're not going to make the azara into a garbage dumping pile because it was a miracle and it all got absorbed, and it answers the question I asked, which was, how could you even? The azara is just going to end up being full of just garbage. Okay, so that was question number one. Why do we have this halacha to break the earthenware vessels if we could just put them in a kiln? And the answer is they can't, because we don't make kilns in Jerusalem, and smoke, all that. But another problem. Hada Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rav Ravua Tanur Shel Mikdash Shel Matechet Hava. But the oven in the temple, we learned, was made of metal. Navi de cheres. Right? We said, why metal? To avoid klei cheres. But if it's an oven of cheres, right? That's sekomi b'fnimu. You could just burn it inside and you don't have to worry about it. So the answer, the reason they did them out of metal was not for the reason that we were discussing. It's for a different reason. Since there's the shtei alechem, the 2 loaves that you have to bring with the Shavuot offering, and the lechem apanim and the bread, the showbread for every week, which you would bake in that oven in the temple, and you would also, as you would bake it, the oven functioned 2 functions: one to cook the bread, or bake the bread, and one to sanctify the bread. Okay, both in the shtei alechem and the lechem apanim. Normally, right, everything that's sanctified in the temple, like for example, the blood goes into a koshered, a sanctified vessel. Right, the komets from the meal offering, put it in the sanctified vessel, the handful. So, since these things are cooked inside and as in the oven, and they also are sanctified at the same time, havale koshered, the oven functions as a sanctified vessel. And koshered echeres lo avdinan, and we don't make koshered out of earthenware vessels. We only make them out of metal. Okay, that's why they're gold, silver. That's generally the ones you see in the temple. Turning now to Amabed, va'afilu, and even according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, who actually allows koshered to be of other materials, lo ka'amar ela de'etz aval decheres lo. He only allowed wood. He didn't allow earthenware. Okay, so that answers question number 2. Why was the oven made? Why wasn't it not made of cheres? And the answer is because it has to double as a sanctified vessel to sanctify these 2 things. Now we get a story. We're going to leave our sugya for a minute. We're going to get a story. It's one of those stories about pride, okay, and people getting upset when people kind of take a jab at that. So Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda, and soon it'll connect with our case, but our topic, but you'll see how soon. Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda have a ragil kameh to Rami bar Hama. Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda would often go to the Beit Midrash of Rami bar Hama. He was his teacher. Shavke va'azil Rav Sheshet. But one day he gets up and he says, I'm going to a different yeshiva. I'm going to go study with Rav Sheshet. So obviously Rami bar Hama got a little offended by this. Right, what's wrong with my shir? So Yom Echad Pagabe. One day Rami bar Hama bumps into Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda on the street. Amar lei. He says to him, okay, Rami bar Hama says to Rav Yitzchak, Al kapta naktan, if a tax collector or a duke, it depends how you translate this, but an important person, okay, grabs you, recha atale liyad, if he grabs you by the hand, will his smell get to your hand? What he wants to say is, what do you call it? But if you surround yourselves or you try to get close to people who are important, do you think that that's going to make you look important? And he says, Mishum da'azal ach l'kamed Rav Sheshet. The fact that you went now to Rav Sheshet, just like if this important, prominent person touches your hand, you don't get his smell, you don't become like that person that people look at you as if you're them. So what, you went to Rav Sheshet, Havi alach ki Rav Sheshet? Did you think you were going to be like Rav Sheshet, that people would give you the respect like Rav Sheshet? In other words, Rami bar Hama said, what, you went to him for the kavod? He's got a bigger name than me? Is that why? And you thought it would influence the way people looked at you? Amar le. So Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda was very offended. Right? That's not the reason, he says. La mishum hachi. It wasn't because of that. Mar ki be'im milta pashat li misfara. When I would ask you a question, you would answer me with logic. Ki mishkachna matnita parchala. And when I found a braita or a mishnah that contradicted your logic, I would question you, and you would have nothing really to answer, because a braita or a mishnah stands up to your logic. But Rav Sheshet, keeping in a miltamine, when I would ask Rav Sheshet a question, pashatli mimatnita, he would answer me from a mishnah or a braita. And if I were to find a braita or a mishnah that contradicted what he said, matnitu matnitahi. It's tannaitic source with tannaitic source. And we've seen this many times. If you bring a question on an amora from a tannaitic source, and the Tana can then the amora can bring out a tannaitic source and say, oh, well, I hold by this one, you hold by that one, that's all fine. In other words, Amoraim can argue against tannaitic sources if they have another tannaitic source to back them, because they could say, oh, that's the one I hold by. Right? These are the rules in the world of the Amoraim. When you're living in the time of the Gemara, you can't say something that goes against a tannaitic source unless you can either reinterpret it some way or find a different tannaitic source and say, oh, I hold by this rabbi and not that one. So when you bring me logic and I bring you braita and you have nothing to say, or I bring you a mishnah, any kind of tannaitic source, you have nothing to answer. But when I go to Rav Sheshet, he first quotes me the tannaitic source. Even if I were to bring another one, if I were to, he'd always have an answer. He could say, I hold by the other one. Okay, so now, Amrle. So what does Rami bar Hama obviously say to him? I'm up for the challenge. Ba'amine milta. Go ask me a question. De'if shalach kimanita, and I'll answer you from a mishnah or a braita. So ba'amine, he asks him. What does he ask him? Now we're going to see why this is here. Bishel b'miktzat kli. If you cook something, the sacrificial meat, in part of the vessel, okay, not the whole vessel. Now it's weird. You think, okay, if I cooked in a pot, doesn't that mess up the whole pot? Well, he's claiming not necessarily. If I cook in part of the pot, then ta'un merika shtifa ain ta'un. Do I have to do this merika and shtifa? Which again, it seems to be at this stage like we're talking about a koshering type thing. Do I kosher it with, right, the whole vessel or not the whole vessel or just the area where I cooked? Now, theoretically, you could have like a long griddle or something where really you only cook in one part and you didn't get to the other. Okay, so you have to think of some sort of case. Soon, maybe the Gemara is going to say this is ridiculous. One of the people we're going to see here, it's going to come up that this is kind of a ridiculous situation. This would happen, but okay, we'll get there. Amalei eino ta'un midi tahave hazaa. So what does Rami bar Hama answer? Now you're expecting Rami bar Hama to bring a mishnah or a braita, but what does he do? He brings again logic. He says, look, just like with a clothing and sprinkling, right? That if the blood sprinkles on your clothing, then you have to wash it, but you only have to wash where the blood was. That actually was a mishnah. Likewise, merika and shtifa. Same thing with this vessel. If it's only in part of the vessel, you only have to clean part of the vessel. Comes Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda and says, "V'halotane hachi," but it doesn't say this in a mishnah. You said you were going to bring me a mishnah or a braita. It doesn't say this anywhere. Amalei Rami bar Hama retorts. He says, "Mistabra kebeged." Well, it talks about the beged in the mishnah. We saw that in the mishnah, and logically, it would seem that it's just like the beged. Ma beged enota un kibus ela makom adam, af kli enota un merika ushtifa ela b'mkom bishul. So just like clothing, it's only where the blood is. Also the pot, it's only where the cooking was. Amarle, so comes the one who asked the question, almost sort of undermining his question. Rav Yitzchak says, midami. How could you compare merika and shtifa to haza'ah, right? Sprinkling, when the blood sprinkles on your clothes and you have to wash it. Dam lo mefa'apeh. Blood doesn't bubble. So it doesn't get to anywhere else on the clothing. But bishul mefa'apeh. But cooking bubbles and it gets to everywhere. Now, either you say, well, why are we asking the question in the first place? Or you say, maybe just it often bubbles, even if in this case it doesn't. But since it usually does, we're just going to be strict in all the cases, and you have to do it. So the first thing that Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda does is he undermines the logic of Rami bar Hama's answer. But then he goes even farther. And he says, not only that, ve'od, and furthermore, Tanya, it says in a braita explicitly the answer to this question, opposite of what you said. Chomer b'haza'ah mi merika ushtifa, v'chomer b'merika ushtifa mi b'haza'ah. So there's a stringency about the law of washing out the blood that's more stringent than the laws of washing, the cleaning out the vessels. And merika and shtifa, the cleaning out the vessels, has a certain chumrah over the cleaning of the clothing. So what are they? The braita continues. Chomer b'haza'ah. Shaza'ah yeshna b'chataot achitzoniot ub'chataot apnimiyot. This issue of the blood sprinkling on your clothes and that you have to wash it if it does is for any type of sin offering, both the ones brought on the inner altar and the ones brought on the outer altar. But you don't have that for merika and shtifa. Why not? Because the inner ones, if you remember, like the ones done in Yom Kippur, the par lim davar shel tzibor, we take the body of the animal out after we do the blood and we burn it outside the temple. We don't eat it, so we don't cook it in any vessels. Whereas chataot achitzon, right? So chataot achitzoniot, those are regular sin offerings that we do. And yeshna lifnei zrika. And it also, the law of the having to launder your garments, if you remember, is specifically before you sprinkle the blood. So before you sprinkle the blood on the altar, if the blood splatters on your clothing, you have to wash it. And it's not true before zrika about the breaking of the vessels, because you don't cook them till after zrika happens. Okay, so those are stringencies by haza'ah that aren't by merika and shtifa. Masha ein came by merika and shtifa, so neither of those apply to merika and shtifa. Chomer by merika and shtifa. What are the two stringencies of merika and shtifa? Shashtifa noheget, shamerika and shtifa noheget bein b'kochim kalim, kochim bein b'kochim kalim. Even though we'll see this in machloket, but according to the main opinion, it applies both for lower level sanctity and for higher level sanctity. Whereas, if you remember, the kibus, laundering the garments, only applies for blood from a sin offering. Bishil b'miktzad kli. Oh, here we go. Here's the chumrah. If you cook in part of the vessel, ta'u merika shtifa kol kli. Masha'en came baza'ah. When it comes to blood on your clothes, it's only the spot where it is. You don't have to launder the whole garment. But when it comes to merika and shtifa, you have to launder the whole vessel, even if the whole pot, even if only part of it was cooked in. So here's a braita, right? How ironic. Rami bar Hama didn't have a mishnah or a braita. Here he brings a braita. Not only does he knock out his logic, he also brings a braita to disprove him. So Rami bar Hama is really defeated in many ways, because he's now proven wrong that he had the wrong answer. He couldn't come up with a braita or a mishnah. There was one, he just didn't know it, and he didn't bring it, and it proved the opposite of what he said. And he obviously was wrong about why Rav Yitzchak left the yeshiva. It wasn't that he was looking for kavod, and more likely it's Rami bar Hama who was the one after the kavod, and therefore, viewed Rav Yitzchak's actions through his own eyes. He was obviously looking for kavod, and that's why he was so offended that he left his yeshiva. Anyway, what are his last words in the sugya? Amar lei, picks up his hands in surrender. I tanya tanya. If you brought a braita, then I guess you're right. It was a braita, and I was wrong. And I was wrong, right, like we say, about everything. Now we just end this section with tamamai. So what is the reason, really, why merika and shtifa are part of a kli? Right? Why you have to do it for the whole vessel? Amar kra ve'im b'kli nechoshet bushala. If it was cooked in a kli nechoshet, it says b'kli nechoshet, in the kli. They darshan from here. Again, it's a drasha. It's not the simple reading. Afilu b'miktzat kli. B'kli means in the vessel. Even in part of the vessel, you still have to wash the whole thing. Now we go to the next machloket. In the Mishnah, there was this machloket, as we just mentioned. Does merika and shtifa apply to kochim only, or also kochim kalim? So Tanu Rabbanan, now we're going to have a braita which darshans the two opinions from the psukim. Chatat. The section where all these things come up, the laundering of the garments, the merika and shtifa, the breaking of the earthenware vessels, starts out with zotorada chatat. It's talking about the sin offering, which is a type of kochim. Ainli ala chatat, and it's only one type, not all kochim. Kol hakodeshim minai. And how do we know that these laws are true? Also, that you need to do merika and shtifa specifically for all of them. Talmud Lomar kodesh kodeshim hi. It says kodesh kodeshim hi. This is in the last pasuk in the section. We're in Vayikra Vav, chapter verse 22. Kol zachar b'kohanim yochalota. All the male kohanim eat it. Kodesh kodeshim hi. It's kodesh kodeshim. So now they say, okay, so from there you learn, again, everything applies to the sin offerings here, and also they apply to all kochim. And not even kochim, also kochim kalim. Even though it's a little weird, they get it from the words kochim, we're going to have to understand how they do that, because kochim you would think maybe is limited to just high-level sanctity. Yachol shani marbeh tatruma. Now you might have thought maybe this includes also truma, that you have to do shtifa merika. Talmud lomar ota. Prat l'truma divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So this last pasuk we just read, kol zachar b'kohanim yochal ota, will eat it. This they eat, not other things. Again, even though it's not just about the eating, it's about, let's say, merika and shtifa and the other laws. So ota comes to say that shtifa and merika is not applicable. Again, this washing and scouring and rinsing, is not applicable to truma. Okay, if we go in levels, there's kochim kalim, truma. So kochim and kochim kalim are included, but truma is not. Rabbi Shimon omer, kochim tunim merika shtifa. Kochim kalim einam tunim merika shtifa. He says very simply, it's only kochim, not kochim kalim. That we saw in the Mishnah. But where does he get it from? Dichtiv, Kodesh Kodeshim, very simply, it says this is for high level sanctity. Remember, like Shlamim is not Kodeshim, right? Shlamim is Kodeshim Kalim. Bechor, Maaser, okay, Pesach, those are all Kodeshim Kalim because they're eaten by the owner. Now, he says, Dichtiv Kodesh Kodeshim, Kodesh Kodeshim in, Kodeshim Kalim lo. So that excludes Kodeshim Kalim. So my time is Rabbi Yehuda. So where did Rabbi Yehuda get it? If it said Kodeshim Kalim, why didn't you say that's Kodeshim Kalim, not Kodeshim? It's Kodeshim, not Kodeshim Kalim. He included Kodeshim Kalim. So what's his reason? Midi'itzrich ota lemiute truma. According to him, he says, look, if Kodeshim Kodeshim meant just Kodeshim, then Kodeshim Kalim is out, and obviously truma is out. So then why do you need the word ota? What's ota coming? It's to limit truma. Well, what does it need to limit? If we already limited, it's not applicable to Kodeshim Kalim, then we know it's not applicable to truma. You don't need a special drasha. So, midi'itzrich ota lemiute truma, from the fact that you need the word ota to exclude truma, michlal, from there you can infer that Kodeshim Kalim to an merika shtifa. You wouldn't need a word, you wouldn't need to exclude truma if Kodeshim Kalim weren't included. If you're going to exclude something, it means the line is drawn right there, which means Kodeshim Kalim is on the side of the Kodeshim. And that's all because we have this extra word ota. It must be coming for something. Now, it wouldn't come to exclude Kodeshim Kalim because Kodeshim Kalim already would have been excluded from just the word Kodeshim. So the fact that we have another word to exclude something, and it's got to exclude something else, so it must be the Kodeshim Kalim are included. Truma is out. Okay, that's how he gets it. Rabbi Shimon, what's he going to do with the word ota then? He obviously doesn't read it that way. He thinks Kodeshim Kalim are out, no matter, because it says Kodeshim, so you don't need the word ota. What's it for? Kid Amar Lacha, Rabbi Shimon would say, ota kid amrina. As we said earlier, if you look in Rashi, reminds us, on Dafa in Gimel, what do we say? Ota kshera v'lo psula, da'avke Rabbi Shimon la'el, chatat shaytala shara kosher v'nefsala. Remember, there were two. We exclude a chatat that was at some point capable of being a chatat and then got disqualified, and one that was never able to be brought as a sin offering at all in the first place. Those are both excluded from the laws of kibbutz, of washing the garments, and that's what he does with those words. Okay, now that was. Did I say tzadi gimel? That was. I hope I said tzadi gimel. It was tzadi gimel, not ayin gimel. If I accidentally said that, and I just want to see right tzadi gimel. Yeah, it was chatat psula for the din of kibbutz. Yeah. Okay. Now. So from there, we say, now we're going to have a difficulty on Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. Because both of them think, whether you include Kodeshim Kalim or not in shtifa merika, they clearly both exclude truma. Okay? It's just a matter, is it excluded in the words ota, or was it excluded because Kodeshim meant not Kodeshim Kalim and obviously not truma? So now we have a difficulty on both of them. Truma lo baya shtifa merika. You don't need shtifa merika for truma? V'atanya, it says in a braita, now, at this point, the sugya assumes shtifa merika means koshering, okay, to get out the flavor. This is basic as right. We know basic laws of basar and chalav. If you cooked meat in a vessel, you can't cook milk in it. That's why we have separate dishes. And if you did, well, it disqualifies it if it gave taste. Okay, if there was enough meat stuck in the sides of the pot that gave taste into the milk, then it would be forbidden. Truma lo yivashel b'chulin v'im bishel b'notein tam. If you cook truma in something, you can't cook chulin in there, and if you want to, basically, and if the truma gives flavor, it's going to forbid whatever you cooked, and that's make it truma. Not exactly forbid, but forbid it to a regular non-Kohen. So if you want to eat truma, if you eat cooked truma in a pot and you now want to use it for other foods, you have to kosher it, which we assume is shtifa merika. So to get rid of truma, you also need shtifa merika, just like to get rid of the kodshim in the vessel, right? If you want to, let's say, cook something else in that vessel. Now, we did say the reason is possibly no tar, right? You just want to make sure you get out the no tar, which is forbidden, and that's the issue. But also, if you were to eat something, right, you want to use it for something non-sacred, you would need to kosher it, you would need to do the shtifa merika. So what do you mean truma doesn't need shtifa merika? It seems clear from here that you do. We can have three answers, but that we can categorize them into two. The first two belong to one category, the third to a different. Am Rabbi, Lo tzricha ela l'da'ar marmar. Now, when we limit truma from the laws of merika and shtifa, which both of them did, actually, according to Abai, it is part of shtifa merika. The limitation is one particular law that we just discussed, which is bishel b'miktzat kli ta'u merika u'shtifa kol kli. When you cook in part of the kli, you need to do merika and shtifa in the entire vessel. That is not true for truma. For truma, if you cooked only in part of a vessel, you'd only have to take out the truma from that part of the vessel. You wouldn't need to kosher the whole thing. Ha truma lo tzarich ela makom bishul. So the truma would only need the space where you cooked. Rav Amar, same type of answer. Lo tzricha ela l'da'ar marmar b'mayim v'lo b'yayin b'mayim v'lo b'mazu. When they both said truma doesn't need merika and shtifa, they meant, now the pasuk says murak v'shutaf b'mayim, with water. The law in the temple is, if you're going to take those earthenware vessels and you have to do shtifa merika, let's assume we mean koshering, you have to kosher them with water. That's what it says. Not wine, not diluted wine, which has water in it. But if you want to kosher truma vessels, you can use wine or diluted wine. That's fine. So again, each of them says one of these unique laws is not applicable to truma. But it doesn't mean that truma doesn't need shtifa and merika. Our third answer is a different type of answer, because Rabbi Barul is going to say, no, truma doesn't need shtifa and merika at all. How's he going to resolve that with the braita? Amar lo tzricha ela l'da'ar marmar merika u'shtifa b'tzonein ha afilu b'chamin. According to the one who says, and we're going to see this soon, the merika and shtifa are only with cold water. It's not koshering. You have to kosher it before you do merika and shtifa. Merika and shtifa is scouring and rinsing. Okay? If you hold that, then the truma, right, afilu b'chamin, the truma just needs hot water, but the vessels that we use for the sacrificial meat needs both the merika, both the koshering, the hot water, and the merika shtifa, which is another stage. And then it doesn't need merika shtifa at all, to which the Gemara says, well, hani chalaman damar merika shtifa b'tzonein. That's very nice if you hold that it's in cold water. But laman damar merika b'chamin shtifa b'tzonein, if you hold that merika is hot water and the shtifa is cold water, what are you going to say? That's part of it is cold, but part of it is really hot, and that's the koshering. So how are you going to explain the truma doesn't need it? Ma'ikal meimar shtifa yiterata. Very simply, the truma needs merika, it just doesn't need merika and shtifa. The shtifa part isn't needed, the rinsing. But the first part of scouring it, which is done with hot water, which is koshering, that you need. Now we're going to go to the next Mishnah, where there's two issues in this Mishnah. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, bishel mitchilat haregel yivashel bo kol haregel. He has a special heter that when you cook in these vessels, we say you have to burn them, right? You have to destroy them after. But not throughout the holiday. Throughout the holiday, you can continue the whole holiday. We're going to have to see why this is. Okay, it doesn't seem to fit with what we learned so far. Chachamim omrim ad zman achila, until you finish eating. In other words, until it's allowed to be eaten. You have to, within that time frame, right? Usually the day and the night, or depending if it's shlam in the day, the night, the day. But you have only until that time. Okay, the words merika and shtifa, some people think it goes before, some people think it's the intro to the next section, which is merika shtifa. How do we do it? Merika ke merika takos, ushtifa ke shtifa takos. So merika is like the way you do merika in a cup, and shtifa is the way you do shtifa in a cup. What does that mean? So some people think it means merika is on the inside, and shtifa is on the outside, rinsing the outside of the cup. Some people say no, merika is scouring, like the way we wash dishes. First you sponge it up with water, then you rinse it off. So the rinsing without the scouring is the second part. Okay, and the scouring is the first part. Merika shtifa b'tzonein, and here you have the opinion that it's all with cold. Okay, not one is hot, one is cold, or both are hot, right? This is the opinion that koshering is independent of shtifa and merika. And then we end, we'll just do the last line, ashapud va'askala magilan b'chamin. The skewer that you cook the meat on, the skewer and the metal rack that you use hot water for to kosher it. This, if you remember, we learned this already. When did we learn it? In Avodah Zarah Daf Ayim Vav, where we had a whole contradiction, because there it seemed to say koshering, a shipud and an askala, you have to do with libun, what we call a blowtorch kind of thing, with fire, direct fire, because it's cooked with direct fire, so you have to kosher it with direct fire. That's usually what we know. Here, it's a little bit different and strange, and you use hot water. And why is that? There's a debate about there were, in the long Sigin of Avodah Zarah, there was a whole debate about how to resolve this contradiction. So if you want to look back at Avodah Zarah, Daf Ayin Vav, you can look back there and see. Okay, that's it for today. Let's do a summary of our daf. Started with 2 difficulties on the answer given to answer this question against Rav. Why did he make us break the vessels? And we said, well, it depends whether you kosher it from the inside or kosher it from the outside. Outside's not good enough. Inside is good enough. So we had 2 difficulties which we resolved. Right, one being the question about why can't you then put in the kiln these vessels from the temple? Why do we have to break them? And then we answered why. Remember, Rav's breaking vessels was the Pesach issue. And the second one was, what about the tanur of the temple? It was done of matechet or acheres, when you could, right? We assumed it was to avoid these problems. No, it wasn't. Didn't have anything to do with that. It was because, right, because you'd have to break them every time. It wasn't because of that. It was because it had to be a koshered. You really could kosher them. Then we got into the story of Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda and the question he asked about bishel b'miktzat kli of Rami bar Hama. And Rami bar Hama's attempt to answer was a very unsuccessful attempt. Then we saw this braita where really it messes up the whole thing. From there we moved to the koshim kiln debate. Which ones need shtifa and merika, all or not necessarily all. From there we got off about truma and asked the question, wait, but both of them say truma, no, but wait, don't you need a kosher, a kli that had truma? To which they ended up saying, well, right, either maybe truma does need shtifa and merika, just not some unique laws about it, and that was the limitation, or maybe it doesn't need it at all because shtifa and merika is not koshering, it's something else. And then we went to the Mishnah, which discusses machlokes Rabbi Tarfon and the rabbis, which we'll deal with tomorrow, about unique exception on the holidays, possibly, according to Rabbi Tarfon, and what exactly shtifa and merika is. At least we get one opinion here, even though we know there's more than one. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Chanukah Sameach.